Ed Lowing, thank you for being here today.
Great to be here.
I think since you have been on the Planning Commission for a while, since 2017, and before that on the Parks and Rec Commission, you are one of the more experienced candidates in terms of government service. You served as chair of the Planning Commission in 2018 during a period of a lot of discord, I would say, is the nicest way to say it.
Quite fair.
I'm wondering if you can describe for us what you believe to be the state of political division in the community, and especially from your perspective as a planning commissioner going through a very difficult time and a divisive time on the commission. Where are we in terms of this political polarization in the community?
In the overall community?
Yeah.
Not particularly on a council or particularly on a commission?
Both, but
Right.
I was thinking of the community in general.
Okay, yeah. I don't think we can duck the fact that there is polarization in the community. But to say that, it's not all in two camps of high growth or low growth or PAS or Palo Alto Forward. It's just a dispute on issues. And one of the ideas that I feel is really important is to kind of get out of the polls. Polarization is okay to begin a debate on an issue, but at some point you have to close the ranks if we're going to get anything done. And that's been the problem. Fighting in the community, fighting on council, fighting on commissions. So I think it's there, but I think that there's some things that we can unite around. One of which, and I don't mean to get ahead of the schedule on issues, but one of which is affordable housing. One might think that that's also split, but I haven't talked to a single resident that doesn't think that's really important as a concrete action that we need to take as a community and as a value statement for where we stand as a community. So I think that there are issues that we're really united on. That said, we also get divided on the details of that. How are you going to put up affordable housing? Where's it going to go? Are we just going to do that or other market segments? So I do think that it's there, but there are issues that we're actually really unified on.
So we'll get to obviously the housing issue in a few minutes, but I want to stick with this with my initial question. On the Planning Commission, when you were the chair, and really during the last few years, there's been a push-pull as to whether the Planning Commission should independently form judgments and take positions, even when it's known that the City Council has a different view of whatever that issue is. This came up several times in the last 2 years on the commission and was the subject of quite a lot of debate. And you sided basically with the majority on the Planning Commission in several cases where you actually were prepared and did take positions that you knew were contrary to what the majority on the City Council wanted to do.
That's right.
Could you explain why you did that and whether you feel the Planning Commission, or all commissions for that matter, are extensions of the council and their political views, or are designed to function as independent commissions that bring forward their own points of view?
That is an excellent question, and I wish there was more visibility on it in the city. You have to go back to the history of why the Planning Commission was formed. It was formed because the residents were mad that they weren't being heard, and they wanted a citizens committee to represent their voice and to give them what is now called a hearing on all these essential issues. And that's how it was formed. So under no circumstances are we the subordinates to the council members or the puppets of the council members. One council member recently suggested that each member each year should pick their own planning commissioner. That's ridiculous. It's entirely against the will of the people then and now. And we should never go into a debate, an open debate, considering things for the first time or reconsidering things by saying, well, let's just go ahead and pass it along to them because we don't have a vote anyway and they're going to overrule it. Our job is to vet each one of these things thoroughly in the context of the current situation, the current time that we're in, and any data that we have that's also presumably new, and make an independent decision on the part of the citizens to go forward. I'm passionate about that. I'm irritated about my colleagues that insist that it goes the other way, because if that's how they feel, they shouldn't even be on the commission. We know we're a recommending body. We know we're recommending the citizens, and we should try to persuade council members based on new data. That's part of our value add that they should be welcoming.
Last question on this, and I'll turn it over for some issue questions, but you dealt with the Michael Alczek controversy and his behavior on the Planning Commission as chair, and had a tough time doing that, I would say, as an observer. Do you feel that, what have you learned from your role as chair on the Planning Commission that might be useful for the community to know in terms of what you're bringing to the city council as a potential leader of the council?
Well, there's a couple questions in there, but I was chair once on the Planning Commission. I was chair 3 times on the Parks Commission. Each one is another year of learning experience. That year was particularly difficult because of the circumstances of the particular set of commissioners. And we also had some tough issues and actually got a lot done on those issues. The point from our perspective, and I obviously can't speak for council members, is that we've got a job to do. And as the issues either are directed to us from PTC or we evaluate them because we're the first ones that are supposed to see it by law, all commissioners get to participate, but commissioners don't get to dominate or bully. And it's the job of the chair to make sure that that doesn't happen, that all commissioners are heard, that the public is always heard, that there's not direct interface between the public and any commissioners. And that's the learning experience there in 18. So.
So a follow-up on your comment about polarization. I wonder if you can point to an example from your own experience where you were able to bring consensus or some sort of collaboration to get people off of those polls. Because if you are a council member and if that is your goal, how would you actually work that?
I think I do it a lot, and it's not always sort of evident. Sometimes within the Brown Act, I'll talk to somebody before the commission meeting, get their read and say, what about this idea? And maybe get something done before we even walk into that meeting. Sometimes you'll see in debate that people will turn to me and say, I think you're the swing vote on this. That's because I'm listening to both sides and I try to get a specific thing on the table that might work for both sides. In terms of a specific example, I'll go back to my first year on the Planning Commission. The comp plan finally came back to the Planning Commission, which, as you know, by charter is our #1 priority as planning commissioners. The preceding 2 or 3 years were a little weird in terms of the normal process, and understandably, some of the planning commissioners were tired. And again, relative to your former question, said, okay, it's been to the Citizens Committee, it's already been to council, so we just are gonna go, yeah, we saw it, take it away. I stood up as a rookie PTC member and said, that is not acceptable. We are then not doing the #1 thing that we are charged to do. It is back to us, it is now back to normal procedure, and we have to work this thing. And there were some older, meaning had been on the commission a while, that did not want to do that. They said, we've seen this before, we're not gonna make any changes. I said, you don't know that. We have to do our job, come up with things that if we think they're wrong, are wrong, and that's gonna be our recommendation to council. And finally, I said, look, we don't have to go over every chapter again. Why don't we each come up with 10 things that we like to chat about? They said, okay, you're right. And so they kind of capitulated to the point that it is our responsibility, and eventually we did do that. We narrowed it down to like 30. We had 2 sessions, I think, of debate. We made substantive recommendations to council that would not have been made. Some of them were passed eventually, some of them weren't. So there we did our job, and I thought we were just capitulating on our major responsibility.
I think kind of going back to what you said about the polarization, it seems like one area in which there's been some coming together was the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2017 and which was then used as the basis to set a goal of 300 housing units per year. I wanted to ask you whether you support the goal of building 300 units per year and whether that's consistent with your position that the city should be exclusively focusing on below market rate housing?
Sorry, in your mask, I didn't get the last part of that question.
Yeah, do you support 300 housing units per year? And do you think that's possible if the city exclusively focuses on affordable housing, as you seem to suggest it should?
I see. Yes, I would support that number until it changes for some reason. And if it changes, it would have to change in an off cycle on the comprehensive plan. But I think if it changes, it's going to go up, which we just have to evaluate and process. My point on affordable housing is that we have to focus on that because it's the hardest one. And if we prioritize that as number one, it has to get the most focus of time, of money, of innovative ways to finance it. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do other segments. If I had to prioritize the next one, I'd move up to the workforce housing or the missing middle, because that one isn't even discussed. At least affordable housing is discussed a lot. So that would be the next one that I'd move up to. I think that the market rate housing is going to happen and would not be off the table because developers are going to be more likely to give us projects in that regard without us having to push as hard to find them. So I don't think that by focusing on affordable housing, that's all we're going to get. I think we're going to get market rate housing, we're going to get affordable housing, and I hope in the context of looking at some of those affordable projects, particularly because developers might want them at a little bit higher rate, that we can solve some of the middle as well. So that's three segments we can solve, two of which we have to work even harder at. The third of which that we discussed, which is market rate, I think will happen because there's developers that want to do that. So I don't think that's contradictory at all.
Well, should we wait for yeah, and since I wanted to get a little more clarity about what you mean by focused on affordable housing. Like, would you support spending a lot of city dollars on it? Would you support zoning changes? And where would the funding come from? And what kind of zoning changes would you support for affordable housing?
Yeah, there's a number of ways to get it. One is definitely zoning changes. I think we should migrate our zoning to more housing in certain areas. I think that the possibility of a modest business tax can contribute to that funding of that. And the last time that was sketched out, the estimate was we would get at least $10 million a year for affordable housing from that. Development fees are in place. They should be looked at again for a bit more upward mobility. But I think one major untapped area is what would loosely be called corporate partnerships. I mean, Google and Apple, for example, have major funds. Google's about $1.5 billion, I believe, and Apple's about $400 million that is targeted just for this. Now, some of that at Google, they want to totally control. So there's not that much room for partnerships. Those are just two examples of funds that already exist. And to my knowledge, we don't have a seat at that table. We have never been in those discussions. So to me, that's just a completely new ground that we can dig. And there are a lot of major corporations around here. Perhaps Tesla would want to do that, et cetera. And I think affordable housing is something that appeals to their business needs as well as their need to be good community neighbors. And so it's in their business interest as well as in their community interest because they need places for low-income workers to live as well.
With the possibility of a business tax, however, aren't they likely to want one or the other approach? I mean, isn't it partnering with a major company that is potentially subject to a future business tax going to be difficult to negotiate?
And anytime you raise the possibility of taxes on anybody, that's going to be on the table, right? But I think that putting those in the same subject is also pretty interesting because it puts forth the statement of our need here. This is what we really need for affordable housing and transportation, for that matter, and they need to help. It's really that simple. So if they say, well, we want to do it in a business tax, so charge us this, or we want to do it by making a housing fund where we can share that with Mountain View and Palo Alto, we'll listen to that too. So I think both of those should be on the table, and I'm obviously willing to negotiate between which of those is easier for them.
What about the use of public property for affordable housing, parking lots, et cetera?
That's a tougher call because, once it's there, it's there. So I'd probably want to think about that a little bit longer, but I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, I think we have to get our hands around the issue that affordable housing is not a phrase. It's not something that council can say, yeah, we need it. I hope some developer comes to town. Affordable housing is not a crisis. Affordable housing is now an emergency. It's an emergency that we have to fix. So we have to change the rules a little bit on what that means to be in an emergency situation. When Wilton Court came up, I, among others, said, we don't want to go through this process of a blanket underlying zoning for this because it's urgent and it's going to take much longer, and we probably aren't going to get like 110% AMI at all in terms of this approach. And one of the reasons for raising those concerns was we wanted it done faster. Well, we, in this case, made a vote on council, on the commission that favored doing the alternative. It was overruled by council. And I'm sorry to say, we were right, because Wilton Court is still not up. So we didn't address that fast enough. And we have to do things that are a little bit out of the norm to make sure that we get this thing done if we value it as Palo Alto citizens.
So, are you talking about things like height limits, density limits? Like what kind of zone changes would you support for affordable housing?
Well, I think that the other problem with that affordable housing overlay is that there wasn't any contextual considerations there. And the place that this theoretical item B, affordable housing, goes up is important. So you can't legislate all the details around parking, height limits, and so on. They have to be looked at in the context of what's already there. So if you put affordable housing in the research park, that's a different consideration for parking and height than if you did it at Palo Alto Square than if you did it in Ventura. So we have to take a look at the context of where these projects are going up in an emergency area, in an emergency crisis.
The 50-foot height limit is citywide. Does that mean that you wouldn't support it because it excludes areas where I take from your answer you would support exceeding it, like Research Park and whatnot?
That's fair, and I was talking to some, we're getting some outside noise here. I told, for example, some supporters or possible supporters that I think the 50-foot height limit should stay as a guideline, and I think that we shouldn't move it to 60 or 70 or 200. I think we've done well by that in terms of how our city looks. If you show me a project, let's say in Palo Alto Square, that's going to put up 300 affordable housing units over the next 3 years, and it has to go to 75 feet instead of 50, I'm going to be in that meeting in a nanosecond listening to what's going on, because that's the kind of pushes that we need to solve this emergency.
One of the proposals for increasing density that's oft talked about is transit-oriented development, so density around transit hubs. But I think one of the complications of that is when transit is actually pulling out of the city. So VTA is cutting services, Caltrain, not sure where it's going financially. So what are your thoughts on transit-oriented development and the need to partner with transit agencies if that's going to actually produce what we want, the car light kind of development?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because we hear all the time that, particularly from the state, that you need to put a lot of dense housing near high-quality transit. And my question is, will you please show me in Palo Alto where there is high-quality transit? Arguably, the train was when it was here, but even that, as we all know, was problematic. Standing room only from here to San Francisco in the mornings and so on. But the VTA has reduced routes, not increased them, and they've told us, bring us more people and we'll increase the routes. Well, I can't bank on that to approve, a huge housing on El Camino. So there's a kind of a chicken and egg thing there. As we know, that the whole region is underserved by transportation. But I believe that the train is going to come back. It will be saved, by hook or by crook, and it will be improved. So I do think that some units located near our two train stations makes a lot of good sense, and some density. makes a lot of good sense, and we've already done that. We worked on the council housing work plan and worked very hard on coming up with the housing improvement plan and put that into effect. It's been slow, as most things are that we put out for the first time, but we're getting a couple of nibbles around that. And the other point of your question is, I think that to get our overall long-term housing goals, it can't just be jammed around those two train stations. So we recently looked at and recommended to council that we allow housing now in the CS zone, like San Antonio. And that basically, metaphorically created new land, because land is the constraint, and now we've created new land where it can go. That's another way that we can address housing in general and affordable housing in specific. The problem there is that it's not really that close to the trains, and it's already a jammed corridor. So I was adamant when we passed this thing, and on this point in the minority, although I got the motion through, is that the city has to commit to an evaluation of that entire corridor on a transportation basis in order for housing to be viable there. So that's a commitment that we have to make, and that was the context of the memo that we sent to council and the motion, because we can't have housing and transportation disparate. They're always linked. Land use, transportation, they're always linked. So that has to be investigated in that situation. Not all of my colleagues agreed with that. They wanted to just slam through housing at any cost, and I don't agree with that. You have to evaluate the impacts, even though you're pressing the gas to put more housing units in.
Speaking of transportation and trains, I wanted to ask you about the grade separation effort. There's a citizen committee that's kind of finishing up its work right now to issue recommendations of grade separation, and it's coming at a time when there's questions about Caltrain's future. How do you feel about the city's effort in planning for grade separations, and do you agree with its timeline for getting to a decision on options in the next few months? And are there any options that you think are particularly viable in your view?
Yeah. Tying in the last question, where land use is always tied to transportation, and we are the Planning and Transportation Commission, that item never came to the Planning and Transportation Commission. So all my answers here are just based on chatting with people on XCAP and so on. First thing I want to say is that council and the city did a good job of involving citizens in the process, a very good job. Midway through, they had to shift the makeup of that committee, which was unfortunate, and maybe it wasn't quite exactly the right shift of makeup of citizens, but it's there. So there was tons of public input, and that's crucial on an issue like this. That was the starting point. Spinning to the end point, we're now in a whole new world where we're struggling as a community on the peninsula to keep Caltrain alive. They also have decided that they're going to start a study right now that's going to take a couple years to do some more analysis. So in spite of all the work that the citizens done and are doing, I don't understand why council would not just press the pause button right now. There's nothing that has to be done right now in a time frame that matches up with what Caltrain is telling us. So that's what I think is the right approach. And I understand that the committee is going to report out over the next couple of months, and council will make a call on that.
I want to ask you about the relationship between council and staff. I've hear a lot of things about the staff, that they're hardworking, that they're overburdened by council direction. You said that staff has been attacked by council members on occasion. Some people say staff are trying to dictate policy and that there's a lack of efficiency. So that could all be true. Some of it can be true and some of it can be not true. What is your sense of where the council's relationship is with the staff and what's needed?
Of your checklist there, I agree with 1, 2, 3, and 5.
Okay.
I don't think that that the city manager and the city is trying to set policy. I think they end up setting policy because they're not getting enough specific direction from council on a number of issues. So let me go back to the top of my answer on that. There's two basic issues with the council in terms of their approach. obviously the starting point is that they're the elected officials. They hire and or fire the city manager. And they are the ones that are in charge of making the priorities. I suggest, as a correction to what I see as the problem, that they set a few top priorities. Say, these are our top priorities. Just like we all do with our ABC checklist every day and every week. And these are the ones that have to get the most time for the city because they are what we need most. Let's be strategic about the top priorities of what we need most. And that will get attention. Right now, I see them assigning 100 top priorities. No city staff can manage 100 top priorities. So that is the number one thing, is that take a strategic approach, define the problems of that you're trying to fix with these top priorities, give direction. The second thing is you need to follow up to see if the direction you've given is actually happening. And if it's not, you can scold somebody in the city, but that's a council responsibility to follow up on that. There are so many examples of things just in the PTC purview that have not happened that were directed to council because the PTC, because the planning department, for example, didn't get to it. The latest one is in lieu parking fees for downtown. Planning was directed over a year ago to bring that to PTC for a hearing, which makes perfect sense. It's a controversial issue. The public needs to opine on that. I am adamant about how often the public needs to opine on these things. Didn't come back. Instead, about 13 months after it was directed, planning came back to the council and said, well, there's not much commercial development down there, so we don't have to have this hold, is what they had done, hold the ability to do that. We don't need that anymore, so we would like you to vote to take off the hold. I saw that coming and talked to a number of council members and said, what? There's no difference between now and a year and a half ago. It still needs a hearing with the public. It doesn't matter if there's commercial development. It matters what we want to do as a policy. And 4 council members listened to me and voted to send it back to PTC 4-3. We still don't have it, but at least they voted for it. So there are a number of examples like that. I'll give you another one. We were told to opine on 35 possible changes to the parking system. This was about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Lacking a chief transportation official, so that should be noted. We eventually got about 3 of those 35 baked into some proposals. I'm not saying that that didn't get done. I'm just saying that was something that was assigned to the staff that council didn't follow up on. So set the priorities, then follow up on what you think are the priorities. And it's okay to say, these are B and C priorities. And the other thing is, the city manager can say no, and he's doing that more and more. I'm glad to see it. He's saying, okay, if we do this, what else do I have to push? As is the planning director, and I support that too. It's a partnership, and they have to have their life run, in a time frame where they can logically plan out. You pile on more while there's staff cuts and budget cuts, it can't get done. So we got to focus to get what we really need in this town.
Speaking of priorities, I want to ask you about the budget real quick. On your campaign website, you mentioned like a 3-pronged approach: public safety, community services, and then capital projects. Next year, the council or the city is set to break ground on one of its biggest capital projects, the public safety building. Do you support moving ahead with that project? And are there any infrastructure projects that you would support deferring or canceling altogether?
Yeah, that's not a quick question, Gennady, but
Your answer has to be quick.
But it's a
I get it.
$115 million question.
I get it. We were doing 1-minute answers last night, so I can handle this. I would look at delaying any capital project that makes sense, that is not subject to things like the safety of the citizens, the safety of the safety department, things like that. In parks, we did this all the time. We just pushed out a park refurbishment a year. So that should be prioritized last, lower than services. And as I noted, and I want to emphasize, we need to base our budget on values, not spreadsheet numbers. There's a limit to that. We may have to take the budget down again, in which case our beloved services are going to have to be cut again. That's just realistic. That's being a budget hawk, which I am, and a fiscal conservative. but prioritize where you make the cuts. And, buildings can probably last a little bit longer. I know that's controversial on the council, and I'll look at new data, but that's my stance.
So public safety building could be delayed potentially?
Yes, I don't have all the data, but yes.
Before we run out of time, which we're about to, I wanted to ask you about police reform, but very specifically, the police union contract in Palo Alto is up for renewal next year. Will you advocate for negotiation that would remove the binding arbitration clause that's currently in that contract? Or if not, will you support state legislation to do the same?
One of the most important things in police reform is getting the union to be a partner. I know that's a tall challenge, but that's where we are. And in my thinking through this, and I know I have a short amount of time, we've done some ad hocs, that's good. We've made some changes, that's good. We're going to put money in there for putting in the RIPA Act for sensitivity training, all that's good. I think we can swap out some services that are non-uniformed officers for drug counseling, intervention people, and even folks that can take first calls for noise problems that neighbors call about, to swap out some police officers for some civilian folks, and it probably is also going to be cheaper. The point on the unions is that they have to cooperate, particularly relative to the incidents of brutality and the incidents of when the city wants to terminate officers. So that is where I would prioritize the discussions with the unions and go into it saying, we can't lock horns on this, folks. We got to come up with a good answer. In terms of the specific arbitration, I'd really like to do a bit more research before I go out on that limb.
You good? Okay, Ed Lowing, thank you very much for being here.
All right, thanks.